thanks again for having me this evening. I appreciate it. And thank you, Sandy, for the glowing introduction. We're going to start with just a couple of slides to kind of go over what we're going to talk about and give you a little idea of, what textures are all about if you haven't done anything with them before. And then we'll get into processing, which is the fun part of everything. So let me just start from the beginning. And I always say, don't delete those images that are maybe not so perfect. Maybe they were taken in less than ideal lighting conditions, or a shot that we like because we were there maybe on a vacation, or somewhere you can't get back to easily. So maybe it's not quite tack sharp or perfect. Tonight, I'm going to show you how you can take those imperfect as well as your perfect shots and give them a wow factor using textures and overlays. The key to working with textures is changing the blending mode of the texture layer. That determines how the texture interacts with the layer beneath it. There's 5 blending modes you're going to use probably 95% of the time, and that's multiply, lighten, overlay, soft light, and hard light. And you'll see how these work, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into using them. Textures are everywhere. So when you're out photographing things, look for things that you can photograph to use as textures. These are all things that I've photographed over the years. Cracked concrete. This was a painted walkway across a parking lot. Fabrics make great textures. In-camera movement, this was just a swipe of trees, and you're going to see how I use that one on an image tonight. This was a knitted scarf that I put a filter on in Photoshop. Wallpaper makes great textures. Hotels are great places to find textures between wallpapers and fabrics and rugs and all kinds of cool things. Some copper or rock, and one of my favorites, rusty metal. And then you can take those textures and also modify them to create new textures. There's a multitude of ways you can do that using Photoshop filters. If you have the Topaz suite still, you can use some of that. And I'm going to show you how I use Topaz Impression to do this one on the right. Smart Photo Editor is great for changing up textures. There's thousands of presets in there. You can use Nik filters, almost anything. And you can also create textures with brushes in Photoshop. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. And these are all ones that I've created with various brushes in Photoshop. And there are lots of resources for brushes. I blog twice a week on Wednesdays and Sundays typically. On Sundays, I give away free textures. And on Wednesday, I do Around the Web, where I list sources that I found for some freebies or articles I think that will be great for, photographers to read and that kind of stuff. So if you are interested in that, at the end, we'll have info on all that. And then, as I mentioned, there's numerous places to get textures online, both free and for purchase. I do give away the free ones on Sunday. I do 3 every week. Although keep in mind that in most camera club competitions, the textures must be your own photos or creations, but you always can use other textures, for your own personal work or for something you're doing, for a project for someone. I have tons of textures for sale on my website, and I did, as mentioned, write 2 ebooks on working with textures and overlays, and I released a course about a year and a half ago on how to create your own textures in a multitude of ways, from in Photoshop and Procreate, by hand with things you can find around the house. There's all kinds of different ways in there, and then how to modify them, and etc. And then I've also done a course on typography and word art. So let's get to the fun stuff. All right, so I'm going to open up my Photoshop. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to create one of those textures with brushes in Photoshop. So we're going to start with a new blank document. So I'm going to go File, New. And I usually like to use 15 by 15 inches for my documents. And I have a preset made. And I'm going to do it at 300 DPI, and I want to start with a white background. Alrighty, so I like to start with a lighter color and build up. We're going to do 3 layers of color in here. So we're going to do everything on a separate layer, and I'm going to show you at the end why that's important. So we're going to add a blank layer. I'm going to select my brush, and for this one, I'm using one of the Photoshop legacy brushes under the dry media brushes, this Kyle Bonus Chunky Charcoal. There are so many brushes you can use for textures. It's really unlimited to your experimentation and imagination. I'm going to make this one about 900 pixels. And these are just, numbers that I've developed from doing the different projects. You would just, when you start with a new brush, kind of jump in there, test a size, see if you like it, and you can always adjust it on the fly. Then I'm going to choose my foreground color picker. And again, you would, select what colors you want to work with. We're going to do blues in this first one, and I've written down the number, so I'm going to type in my number, and I'm going to do 4D, 8D. So I'm going to start with this lighter blue. And you want to make sure your brush opacity and flow are at 100% because we can always lower them later, but we can't increase them once we're done. And then we're just going to start stamping. Now you'll notice as I'm stamping this, I'm just clicking with my mouse that the brush is rotating, that it's not the same angle all the time. This particular brush is preset to do that. Some brushes are not. So if they're not, what you don't want to get is a pattern going in your texture. So you can go into your brush settings and then go into your shape dynamics. And this angle jitter is the one that's going to make the brush rotate. And it doesn't have to be at 100%. It could be anywhere in between, just so that it's not at 0 and doing the same exact thing every time. The other thing you can change, if you want the size to vary, you can change the size jitter. There's a lot of different things you can do. You can make it more or less round, and then you can also scatter it more. If you want it to be more random where it stamps, sometimes I do that. This one I'm going to leave here so we can kind of just put it exactly where we want it to be. And you also want to make sure you get the edges of your page. And then just, I'm not clicking in a straight line because I don't want to get that pattern going. So just going to randomly move the cursor around. And if you happen to get too much color in one area, you can do a Control Z and get rid of that stroke. I am working on a PC, so I'll usually say Control. In a Mac, that would be Command Z or Command whatever shortcut we would want. So that would be our first layer, and we kind of want it fairly even. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then we're going to add another layer. And I'm going to keep using the same brush, but I'm going to make it a little bit bigger now. We'll go up to like 1100 pixels. And we're going to choose our next color, 203 D57. And then we're just going to start doing the same thing. So sometimes when you are doing the second layer, it's kind of hard to see if you've gotten all of the space filled in. So I'm going to turn off that first layer just so I can see better. And we're just going to continue to do this. It's kind of a mindless task. It's, once you select a brush, it's just kind of, okay, let's have some fun. And it's, it's relaxing. It's interesting to see what you can come up with. Like I said, all kinds of different brushes will do all kinds of different textures. Okay, so that would be our second layer. Get a little bit more there. So there's our 2 layers together. We're going to add one more layer, go a little bit bigger again, and a little bit darker. 51829. And again, I'm going to turn these 2 off while I stamp this layer. And I have one I did a little bit neater that's already done. I'll show you at the end. And so like here, I got like a little bit too much, so I can go Control Z to get rid of that one stroke and then continue on. You just don't want to have a big blob in one spot because then it would affect, when you start to use it as a texture. Okay. So that's good for now. So let's turn all three on. So there is our basic texture. So sometimes the darker color maybe is too overpowering on top. So you can always take that layer and maybe drag it down under the other two. So you get more of the lighter blue. Like I said, I like to start with the lighter color, but sometimes I do switch them around a little bit. So the first thing you want to do when you save this is you want to save it as a TIFF or a PSD file. And so that you can keep these layers. And I'm going to show you in a moment why that's important. And then after you've saved it with the layers, then you can save it as a JPEG, and that's what you'll use to bring in as your texture. So you would just go to File, Save As, save it as your texture in a folder that you've created, and then go ahead and save your JPEG. And then this one is with a white background. We can also change the background color. So I'm going to add a layer below this and choose a lighter blue. F8. And then I'm going to fill this layer with the color, and the keyboard shortcut on a PC is Alt Backspace. On a Mac, it would be Option Delete. And I think that's a little bit too dark. So the reason I like having this white layer behind anything, where I have transparent layers, is I can now lower this opacity without it becoming transparent. If I didn't have this white layer, my background would be becoming transparent. And then it would show, when I put it on as a texture, more of my image would show through because of that transparency. So we can adjust this again, to wherever you like, and then we can save that as another version. So I'm going to put this one back on top for a moment. And one of the reasons that it's good to keep the layers is, let's say we really like this texture, but we want it in green. Well, rather than restamping all these layers, we can just change the colors of our layers. So I'm going to select the first layer, go over to my color picker, and I'm going to choose 69DC6C. Now, if I did an Alt Backspace like I did with this layer, it would fill the entire layer with color, which is not what we want. We just want the color on the pixels that are already holding color, with the transparent ones staying transparent. So if we hold the Shift key when we do our Alt Backspace or Option Delete, it now only puts color on the pixels that already hold color. So we can turn on layer 2, select our next color, and Shift Alt Backspace. And then we'll do our third layer. 064 808, Shift Alt Backspace. And then we can also change our background color. 9 2 F8 4. And now I can just do an Alt Backspace because it's a solid and I already have the opacity down. You could adjust that, more or less as you want. And now you have very quickly a whole nother texture in another set of colors. So we can save this as another layered version if you wish. You want at least one of the layered versions. You don't necessarily need both. And then you would save it as your JPEG. So the other things you can do with your textures, once we have everything made, I'm going to go ahead and flatten this. And then we can also do some blur on here. So let's do a filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And you can blur it as much or as little. And this would make it a great texture to use over a background behind a flower or something, where I wouldn't necessarily use it at 100% like this, but to blend it with a background and kind of cover up some busyness in another background. And you could save this also at several different versions. You could, save it with less blur, with more blur. And there's another way of doing it. And I'll open up my one I previously did when I spent more time on it, and it's pretty similar. But you can see how it's filled in a little bit nicer.
I have a question.
Sure.
How did you flatten that?
I just did
Under-
image or layer flatten image because I wanted to just flatten it all, but you don't want to do that until after you've saved it with your layers so that you can come back and do other colors and make other changes.
I see it now.
Okay. Anybody else before I move on? So that's just one simple way of making a texture with that particular brush. Like I said, there are thousands and thousands of brushes out there that you can find. And also, if you're on the Creative Cloud, when you go into your brush menu, if you hit this gear wheel up at the top right, and you go to Get More Brushes, this will take you to the Adobe site, and you can get all kinds of brushes here for free because you have the Creative Cloud. So they always have a new, like 4 times a year, they come out with a new bundle. And then there's all these other ones that they have that they've released before. And when you just click on download, normally when you download something from the web, you then have to, unzip a file and then install it. With these, they go immediately to your brush panel. You don't have to even do anything. You just hit download and that'll show up right immediately in your Photoshop. So that's a pretty cool little extra thing. And if you wanted to import other brushes under the gear wheel, you would just go to import brushes and go to wherever you have them saved on your computer. And a tip for you, make sure you save all the brushes that you import. Do not rely on Photoshop to keep them all safe and secure, because many times I have had it happen where all of a sudden Photoshop like reset my brush panel and everything was back to just the defaults. So you want to keep them in one folder and know that these are the ones you've already downloaded, and then save other folders with different styles of brushes, because there are so many. You can see I've got a bunch in here. I have a bunch in my store. I have in here, and then all these other different ones I've been working with lately. And you don't want to put every single brush that you have in Photoshop because it will slow down your system, especially when it's starting up. And I've got quite a few right now. I probably should narrow that down a little bit, but it gets addictive. There's so many cool ones out there that you like to try for different things. I've got lightning I was using. You could see I did that in my webinar on Tuesday. There's cloud brushes, there's light beams, there's stars, there's all kinds of things you can do.
So how do you go about saving your brushes in a file?
You would just, when you download from the web, let's see if I have one saved over here. I'm going to bring over my other screen for you so I can show you. I don't know if I have some saved here. I thought I did. I'll show you. It's real easy. So if you were online, or I can just actually, let me bring one in from another folder. Go into my Explorer. So I have a separate file. Whoops, let me go here. Photo assets. I have brushes, I have fonts, I have gradients, I have all kinds of things. And there's just like tons of them. And I'm still working on trying to get these reorganized because it's such a mess. But like under my brush file, you can save them by, like cloud brushes, grunge, gothic. You can make different categories. And then once you have them in here, they're going to be in, that's the PNGs and JPEGs. That's not really.
So if I download one from Adobe,
I'm sorry?
If I download one from Adobe, you say it'll automatically go to my
Yes,
Photoshop.
those will go right into your Photoshop because you could always get those again there if something were to happen. But anything that you go, I have a bunch of, actually, I don't think I sent you my brush resource list, Sandy. I'll send you that afterwards. I sent you the other stuff. I have some sites that are really good to get lots of stuff, and they're mostly free. Almost all of them are have some free stuff. So like if you go in here and you have the brushes themselves will be an ABR file, and that's what you would import into Photoshop.
Okay,
Okay.
thank
So
you.
you can't open that here to see what they look like. That's why some of them will give you like a JPEG version so you can see little thumbnails of it. Until you import it into Photoshop, you can't really see them other than when you're looking at them online.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and close this one and close this one. So next up, I'm going to show you, actually I have it right here. I was just testing something before. Get off the brush tool. This was a photo I took of some cracked paint on an old car. And I'm going to use Topaz Impression to make this a very painterly looking texture. So I'm going to duplicate my background layer. If any of you who've known me for a while know I used to teach for Topaz. I did 13 webinars for them. And then in late 2019, they decided that they were going to no longer update all the creative programs like Topaz Studio and all of the things that go along with it. They are focusing solely on the AI Sharpen, Gigapixel, all that kind of stuff. Just there's like 4 programs, that's all. Which is a big bummer because I think their creative stuff is unparalleled. I did a webinar probably about a year and a half ago, trying to find other programs because people would ask me, well, what can we use if we can't use this? And I found programs that would do certain components, but there's nothing that does everything that Studio could do all in one place. I'm hoping at some point they'll decide to, like Nick did, to let the program go to somebody else and have them take it over and update it because it's such a great program. So as long as this deal works, I'm going to keep using it. I don't use it probably as much as I used to, but I do still use it. So in here, if you have Studio, we're going to go to add a filter, and I'm going to use the impression filter. And from here, you can see it's already just the defaults are starting to make some changes. And it's like anything, any kind of plugin program, it's a matter of playing around and seeing what works on the image you're working with. So I just started moving sliders, and I'm going to make my brush bigger. I made the paint volume a little heavier, and you're going to keep seeing it change as I move these different sliders. Paint opacity, I brought it down a little bit. Stroke rotation will let the paint strokes kind of move around like what we were doing with the one in Photoshop. This program was based on real paint strokes from real paintings. So it's very, really looks like a painting when you're done. And you can vary the color a little bit if you wish. And then we can adjust the stroke width and the stroke length. And then the spill is going to be the one that's really going to make this work. And a little bit of smudge. And there we have it. So I'm going to accept that to go back to Photoshop. And the reason I duplicate my layer is because Topaz does not make its own layer the way the Nick products do. So I always like things to be on a separate layer, and then I can either delete it when I come back here if I don't like it, or change it or whatever. So the only thing I didn't really like about this was some of these darker areas. So I just grabbed my healing brush, and because it's a texture and we don't have to be too particular, I'm just gonna kind of brush over some of these areas and get rid of the really dark spots that I didn't like. You can go over it again if you want. I'm not really thrilled with that. So you can always modify textures, and I do this a lot of times once I create different textures. I'll heal and clone and do different things to make it look the way I think it should. And there's a whole new texture that looks completely different than what we started with. And I'm going to show you how I use this one on an image. I'm going to open up an image. And this was one I took quite a few years ago on a photo outing. It was in an old factory that happened to have this organ in it. And I'm going to bring in the texture. I have a version already saved. So I'm working with two monitors, and that's why you see me kind of dragging things in. I'll show you how to add a texture in the next project if you aren't working on a second monitor. So by bringing it in this way, it automatically puts it on a separate layer, and then I can just fit it to my image. And this is where the blending modes come into play. So in this one, I'm going to use a blending mode of multiply. So when you have a lighter colored texture like this, the lightest areas are basically going to fade away. Multiply is going to darken the darker areas of the texture. And then I brought down the opacity just a little bit. And I liked the way that this one kind of made the pages of the book and the keys especially a little more antique looking and a little older. So here's the before and there's the after. Before, after. So it added a little more, darkness to the image because of the texture, but it also added, I think, a little more character to the image. So that's a real simple, just a one texture over an image. Any questions? Okay.
How come you don't see that layer on dark fragments of that piano? Just the notes.
Because of the blending mode. Let me open up that one again. I'll show you.
I missed that.
That's okay. So because the texture is very light and we're using a darkening blending mode of multiply, what that will do is multiply is going to darken the darkest area of the textures, and the light colors like the nearly white are going to almost vanish. So that's why it starts to just darken those certain areas. And those are the darkest areas of that texture.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and conversely, if we have a very dark texture and we use the lighten blend mode, it's going to do the opposite, and you'll kind of see that more as I go along. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so next up, this is one of those definitely imperfect images. This was a flower I took years ago up at the Rose Garden in Hartford, Connecticut. Until 4 years ago, if you guys don't know, I lived in Connecticut my entire life, and we now live in Northeast Tennessee. We've been down here, it was 4 years, the end of October, and absolutely love it. So it's definitely a change of pace, though. The much slower Southern lifestyle. Definitely not as frenetic as when we were in Connecticut. So anyway, this image, I liked the center of this flower, even though it's not tack sharp. It was a softer image, but I liked that part. But I didn't really like this super heavy blur on the petals down here. So it was one I had edited and just kind of set aside. And then when I started working with textures, this was probably one of the first 2 or 3 that I tried textures on. So I'm going to bring in a texture, and if you're working with just one monitor, the best way to do it is go to File, place embedded. And what that's going to do, it's going to bring in that texture the same way as if you dragged it from another screen. So I'm going to bring in this texture. And it's going to do the same thing. It's going to place it on another layer. And then this one happens to be the same dimension, so I don't really have to resize it. But if I needed to, I would just stretch it, to fill, so that it covers my image, and then hit to check mark. So that's an easy way to bring in a texture. This was a piece of scrapbook paper that I photographed. So and you can find some really cool stuff at any of the craft stores around. I'll carry scrapbooking type supplies. So this one I changed to soft light, which is one of the lighter blending modes. So this group works, is darkening blending modes, this first section. This section are lightening blending modes. And then this section works with the midtones and contrasts of the image. So again, I'm going to work with soft light on this one. And then I brought down my opacity to about 82. So I like the way that looked down here. I thought it, you could read the lettering. This blurred petal became, subdued. It actually works well with the writing over it. But I wanted to take the writing off of the center. I want that to be my focal point. So I'm going to add a layer mask. Grab a soft round brush. And I'm going to actually go with about 50% hardness, somewhere towards the middle. I don't want it to be too soft, but I want it to be soft. And make my foreground color black. And I don't need it that large. So right now it's at 100% opacity, which means I'll take off all of that texture, which I want to do from the middle here. So I'm just going to paint in here. And when I let my finger off the cursor, you'll see over here is where I've painted away all that texture. And I want to blend it around here. So I don't want it to be a sharp delineation between the areas with and without texture. So I'm going to lower the opacity of my brush to around 50%. And it doesn't have to be exact. I usually just click somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to kind of go along that edge between the two and take off some of that texture. And like with any mask, if you mess up and take off too much or not enough, you can always flip it back to white and paint it back in. And then you can use the X key to flip back and forth. I don't know if that's pure white either. And then just paint back with black to remove. And I think that works. And then the last thing I decided it needed was just a slight vignette. Even though some of the edges are a little bit darker, I wanted to kind of even that out. And you can use, like Nick has some vignetting filters and stuff, but if you need to create one real quick right here in Photoshop, it's easy to do. Just add a blank layer. And we're going to fill that layer with black. So I'm going to do my Alt backspace. We come up to our marquee tools, and I'm going to grab the elliptical marquee. Place my cursor almost up to the corner. Click, hold, and drag down to the lower right corner. Now I want to soften this circle because if I were to take out the center right now, you have a very hard edge, which of course we don't want. We want it to be nice and soft and blend. So we're going to go to Select, Modify, Feather. And I typically leave mine at 250. It just gives it a nice soft effect. Say OK. And then you hit either your delete or your backspace key to knock out the center. And Control D to deselect. Now, of course, that's much too dark. So we're going to bring the opacity of this way down. You never want someone to say, gee, nice vignette on your image. You want it to be so subtle that somebody who didn't see the before isn't going to even realize it's there. So there's our before and there's our after, where we just tone down those edges a little. So we really focus the viewer's eye where we want it to go. So doing a vignette's easy, and you can make a vignette any color. It doesn't have to be black, but typically, we're trying to darken it, but sometimes you want it to be white if you want to fade edges, or it can be a color. You can change the color to match something you're working on. And there you have it. Any questions?
I have one.
Sure.
When you first began,
Mhm.
what did you, it was called an embedded?
Yes, file, you go up to the file key and place embedded.
Place embedded, okay.
Mhm.
That was
And
my
no problem. And that will let you bring in that texture right here into this image on a separate layer.
question. Good.
I used to have people open it as a second file and then use the move tool to drag it in, but this is so much quicker. I don't know why I never did that before.
Yeah.
But we all keep learning new things. That's what makes this fun. And I always learn things from my students. I always, I never claim to know it all. And most of the things in Photoshop, there's multiple ways of doing it. So, um, dive in and have fun. That's what it's all about. All right, so next up, we're going to use this, that one I showed you, the in-camera motion, the blurred trees. First, I'm going to open my image. And besides adding texture to an image, you can also use the colors of the texture to modify the colors of your image. And this particular one is a great example of that. I'm going to bring in my blurred trees. Again, it happens to already be the same size. And this was an in-camera swipe, and I did add just a touch more blur with the motion blur filter and just kind of blurred it a little extra bit. So this one I'm going to change to overlay. And again, most of the time I lower it just a little bit. It depends, but generally 100% is too much. So not only do we now have some texture back here, but you can see the original is a very cool toned image, where now, because this has yellows and browns and very warm colors, it's warmed up this image and given it a completely different look than the original. So again, you can use, textures like this that are a very subtle texture to, just add a little interest, and it shows up mostly, on the blurred background here, but you really get the effect of the color more than the texture on the subject. So textures can be used for lots of different things. So now we're going to start using multiple textures, which is how I typically work. So I'm going to open up this image first. And I kept this as a layered file when I first bring it in, just to show people what I've already done with it. So my original was this, and this was in my backyard in Connecticut a few years ago. This guy landed on one of the poles left in our garden after the season. And this is just grass and a sidewalk of my neighbors behind it. But the shadows were really dark on this, so I needed to open that up a little. So first I used Viveza to do that, the Nick Viveza, and I only wanted the effect on the birds, so I added a layer mask, and I'm going to show you how to do that with the texture in a moment. And then sometimes depending on what programs I'm using next, I will create a merged layer. Some people call it a stamped layer. And all this is a combination of all the layers below it without flattening those layers. So sometimes you want to keep those in case you need to go back to them later. So like with Topaz, it doesn't add its own layer. And Topaz can only read the top layer if you've got multiple layers in your file. So I will create a merge layer. And the way you do this, it's also nicknamed the claw because you need several fingers to do this. On a PC, it's Control, Alt, Shift, and the letter E. So what I'll do, let me turn this one off and I'll go here. Control, Alt, Shift, E. And it creates that new layer, and that's a combination of what's below it. On a Mac, that'd be Command, Option, Shift, E. And I always rename it merged so I know what that layer was. And to rename a layer, just double click on the word and you can type like that. Okay. So then I ended up using Nick products, which can read all the layers, but I wasn't sure that I was going to at that point. So that's why I had done the merge layer. And then I did a little bit of define to crisp it up or to get rid of the denoise, and some sharpening to sharpen it up a little bit. So from here, we're going to now start working on our textures. So the first one I'm going to bring in is this faded rust. Again, I think our size is good. And this one, I'm going to change to soft light. And I only brought it down just a hair to like 95%. Now I like the way that looked on the background, but I don't want my bird to be green. So even though we have this mask here, I'm going to show you how to create a mask. So I'm going to click on the layer below it that has the bird in it. Go to my quick selection tool and select subject. And we're going to let Photoshop do most of the work for us. And it did a pretty good job. Usually it does better, but we can add a little bit here. And we'll grab that. I also want this post in there, and we can fix the tail after we get our basic mask in there. So now I'm going to go back to my texture layer and now click on the layer mask. Now it's added a mask, but that's actually reverse of what we want because the texture's on the bird and not on the background. So we can just do a Control or Command I and it will invert that mask because we want to mask the texture off of the bird and the post. So it's just on the background. And then like any mask, we can go in with a brush and fine tune where we wanted this to not be. I should be at 100% there. It's easy to forget to change that back. There you have it. So that's our first texture. Next, I'm going to bring in this watercolor one. This is one I created in Photoshop. It's part of one of my sets in my store. And this one we're going to do at hard light. And the opacity is about 80. Now again, I don't want that texture on the bird. So if you select this mask, click in the mask, hold down your Alt or Option key and click and drag the mask, it will duplicate it. So another little tip. Now, the bird kind of looks like he doesn't really belong because he's so much brighter than the background. So if I wanted to bring back just a little bit of this texture, you can double click in that layer mask and that will open up the properties box. And we have a density slider, which is basically like opacity. So if we bring this back a little bit, I'll bring it down more. You can see the colors coming back in the bird. I don't want that much, but I just want a little bit to warm him up so he kind of fits better with the background. Maybe at about 70. So you can see how it's more gray because now it's a little bit more transparent. So that's an easy way to adjust the density and or opacity of your mask. And I'm going to bring in one more texture, and this one is going to be some other writing. This is a a JPEG version, or a PNG version with a transparent background. And this is part of a set that's, I have also brushes that come with brushes and the PNGs. And this one, I don't want to just stretch it sideways because it's going to distort the writing too much. So I'm going to hold my Alt key and just make it bigger this way. And you can always go off the edges of your image. You don't have to keep it constrained. And then I'm going to just stretch it just a little bit. And then you could also, move it around till you get a part of the writing you like. It may look different in different areas. And then this one I'm going to change to soft light. And lower the opacity way down to about there. And again, I want to copy this mask that takes all of it out because I don't want any of the writing to be on the bird. So hold my Alt key, click and drag. And there you have it. So this one, by using soft light, it became kind of a grayish color because we also lowered the opacity. If you were to use like lighten or screen, now it becomes more white because it was black lettering. So that's where I said the different blending modes will give you different effects. So it doesn't hurt to, when you're in here, if you just run your cursor down, you'll kind of see what the different modes do and how they work with that particular image. So linear dodge is going to be a brighter white, lighter color almost fades it away. Overlay, soft light is lighter, hard light's going to be darker. Vivid light I don't use very often. Most of these down here I rarely use with textures. Every once in a great while, but not very often. So don't be afraid to just try some of them. And people often ask me, well, how do you know, what texture to pick? How do you begin? Obviously, I've done these projects before, so I have it all ready to go to demonstrate for you. But when I first open an image, I'll open up maybe half a dozen textures and turn them all off and then just try different blending modes and see if I think it will work with that image. Because like I said, I usually work with, 2, 3, 4 on an image. I do have a webinar and I will also send that to you, Sandy, the number of it. It's on, all my webinars are on my YouTube channel. And that one I did is actually, do I have it on here? I had a list for something else I was working on, but I will send you the number of that one. And what I did for this webinar, because I get this question all the time, was I only chose images to work with. I did not pre-select textures. I demonstrated live how I go about picking some and trying them and that kind of thing. So it kind of gives you an idea of the thought process. And the more, go ahead.
Oh, this is Sandy. I was just saying good. I'll just make sure that I get everything from you, and
Yes.
I want to assure all members that I'll be sending it out when I send out the link to the recording.
Okay, sounds good. And the more you work with textures, the more you kind of get a feel for what might work. Like I mentioned, different colors, the actual textures. Are you going for a very grungy look? Are you going for something more subtle? I do a lot of work. We have lots of old barns down here in Tennessee, and I do barn workshops. But when I photograph those, I tend to go for more of a vintage kind of a feel, more of the grungy type of a look. So different textures are going to give you different results, of course, and it's different on every image. So you really do have to try them. There's no, I'm always going to use this texture on this kind of image type of thing, because it really is experimentation. Any questions on that one? Okay. So next up, this one is actually from my first ebook. And that one I wrote when I was still working with Photoshop Elements. This was way back when. And this image I have 6 textures we're going to put on it. And my books have, not only do you get the actual PDF of the book, you get all of the images, textures, brushes, whatever were used in the projects, plus some bonus stuff, so that you can recreate the projects along with the instructions. The set I'm using on this image are going to be from Flypaper Textures, because this was back before I was creating my own. And they allowed me to share them with, in the book, and they even gave me a bonus set for them. So that's another great company to work with. So this one I changed to overlay. And this one I did leave it 100%. There were a couple in this project I did. And you can see it's a very subtle texture, and because it's blue on blue, it's not changing the color a whole lot. It's really just adding that very subtle texture, but we're going to keep building the texture in this one. Next up, is this kind of bluish green color. And this one I did at multiply to darken it. And I also left that one at 100%. I liked the kind of, brush strokes almost in here, and the kind of follow. I like when textures and clouds and things kind of follow, along with my subject. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. This one I'm going to use overlay and bring this one down to about 54, 55. And so now we've darkened our image a little bit more. And this one I liked because it had like a linen texture to it. So it started adding, if you zoom in, you can see the texture actually in the image itself. Give it kind of that painting kind of a look. And then this next one has got some yellow, which I thought these swirls might be good for the sky. And the name of it is Neural Clouds. So I thought since it had clouds in the name, maybe it would actually look like clouds. This one we're going to do at soft light. And initially I left it at 100%, but the more I do this project, the more I think it needs to come down just a little bit. So it's not too much of the yellow, but you do get a little bit of the effect in there, and it just makes the colors vary one to the other. And then number 5 is, this one's called Limoncello. So this is a perfect example of where we're talking about the lighter colors are going to fade out when we do a multiply blending mode. So the multiply blending mode is going to darken the darkest areas of this image. And this one's not quite pure white, so there'll be a hint of color, but it's pretty much going to disappear. So when we go to multiply, you can see it's just picking up that border more than it is anything that was in the center. And this we're going to bring down here. And lastly, I brought this one in because it was a nice light blue, and I thought this might brighten the whole image up a little bit. I'm going to do this at overlay and about 60%. And then you can always turn things on and off and see if you like something or don't like something, or maybe I want to lower that, opacity even more. You can also move the layers around like we did when we were creating the one with the 3 layers of color, because sometimes that will change the way they look depending on the blending modes that you have selected. So there's lots of ways you can, play with things. Like I said, once I start playing with more than one, I definitely will, turn things on and off and go, okay, well, I like that texture. Maybe it's just a little too dark. Bring it down here or make it heavier. So there's different ways that you can, adjust it even after the fact. Any questions? It's so much fun to work with textures and stuff. It's one of those things you have to just jump in there and do it and then really see it come together in front of you. So next up, I'm going to take what is definitely a typical throwaway image. And this was the original, straight out of camera. This was my blueberry bush in my backyard in Connecticut. And it was a gray day, so nothing going on in the sky. I just really liked the way the petals were starting to unfurl on everything. So I decided to, great questions. That's a question I get often. When do you know where to stop? And I should have mentioned that with the last project. And my answer is always when you like the way it looks. If you like it with one texture, great. If you want to try a couple more, and maybe you do, maybe you don't. When you get to something that you really like, then that's where you stop. So that's a super question, and I do get that one a lot too. So with this one, I just selected selected the branch and deleted the background. And the way I did that, I can show you real quick. I do have it already done, but I'll show you quickly, is using the select subject. And we can take away this selection because we don't really need that. And then I'm just going to turn that layer off. If you don't duplicate the background layer, which you really, whoops, don't need to do. Let's get rid of that one. Just make sure that you unlock the background layer, because when I hit delete to delete my background, if I don't have that unchecked, it won't become transparent. It'll become white or whatever your foreground color is. So I actually need to invert this selection because right now it has the branch selected. So select inverse. And now we have our background selected, and I'm just going to hit the delete or the backspace key. And there you have it. It's now on a transparent layer. So I already have one in position because I did flip this to horizontally. I went up to edit and transform, flip horizontal, and then I cropped it a little bit and angled it a little bit more. So this is the one we're going to work with. So what I did with this one is I brought in a couple textures in the background. And the reason I did that is because they're shades of pink, and the pink over the green leaves, I'll bring one in and you can see it. It just didn't really work very well. So that's sometimes the advantage of having a transparent background if you have a subject you're just trying to create a texture for. So if I were to just leave that here and change the blending mode, nothing really worked good. It just made the green leaves look really weird. So I'm going to bring that one underneath. And then once I brought this in, I noticed that the branch is going, left to right this way, but the darker part of this texture is going the opposite. So I'm going to flip the texture as well. So edit, transform, flip horizontal, and that flows a little better. And then I'm going to bring in another texture. And these two I shot also at the Rose Garden up in Hartford. One morning, one of my camera clubs, we all went to photograph the roses, and it was so windy that it was really hard to get a sharp photo of a rose. So I put on some extension tubes and just shot some bokeh and did some cool different things. And this one as well, the background's kind of going the other direction. So we're going to flip that one. And this one worked out perfectly. When I flipped this over, I was amazed at how it just followed the contour of this branch. Like I could not have planned that better if I tried. So this one, I'm going to change the blending mode to darken and then bring down the opacity a little bit. So that is our two background textures. Next, I'm going to now select this layer because I'm going to start bringing textures in above it. This one is some more rusty metal that I did with impression to get this nice painterly kind of a look. And this one we're going to change to soft light and bring it back just a little bit. So again, the color brightened it a little because it's like yellows and browns, and it warmed it up some more from the pink and just really started to add some nice texture. This was shot at the Botanical Garden in New York City, in the Bronx. And this was a clay pot with, like the calcium buildup that they get, and just a real tight close-up. So trust me, everything can become textures. Don't be afraid to look for different things when you're out photographing. And this one I also did soft light. And bring that back a little. So now you can see we're really building up kind of that grungy-ish texture in there, which I really like. And lastly, I have this border. And I really like this because it had the orangey colors that went with the image. But I noticed that the color is mostly in the upper left, on the right, and then the left and the bottom. So once I get this in place, and change my blending mode, I'm going to duplicate it and flip it vertically so that we also have some color in the other corners. So again, this one's pretty much a white in the center. So when we do multiply, it's going to get rid of the center and just pick up those edges. And I brought that down a little bit. So it's just a real subtle bit of color on the edges. It's not a real vignette, just adding a little darkness, a little extra emphasis. So I'm going to do a Control J and duplicate that. And then we're going to go to Edit, Transform, and flip it vertically. Actually, either way would work. And so now we have equal color all the way around. Oh, I like this. I like the way this one came out after I had completed this. I haven't done it yet, but this would be great on a card. That yellow rose with the writing on it, the early one that we did, that one I did do note cards of, and they came out real nice on a glossy stock.
Hey, I'm Hazel.
Mhm.
I noticed that some of the the textures you use where the colors are on the edges, do you use those a lot to create a natural vignette for you?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And I love when I find a texture like this one that we used earlier that kind of
Mhm.
has a built-in vignette. And
Right.
when I create them, I sometimes do that myself, so that you don't really have to add a true vignette. It just gives you that, little extra, punch of color and darken the edges without it being a real vignette. So yeah, I
Right.
do like textures that have that.
Well, I kind of like it because you're not using it as like a black vignette, but it's actually
Exactly.
colors around the edges,
And
giving
if
a
you
natural
wanted a
vignette.
different color, you could definitely change the color, like we
Mhm.
did when we were changing the colors that we, when we were creating one. Say we wanted
Mhm.
to go with more of a, let's go with a kind of a darker peachy color. And in here, that's a good question. How would I do that? Because this is not transparent in the center. Actually, instead of doing that, I would do a hue and saturation adjustment. So I would do hue and saturation, and I would clip it to that layer because I only want it to apply to that texture and not everything else.
Mhm.
And then you could, start playing with you. If you look in the upper left
Okay.
corner, you can see it
Mhm.
changing. So
Right.
you could definitely, pick a different color or modify that color a little bit. And then I would duplicate that to this layer since it's the same.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
a lot of times too, that's a good point. I think do I have one come up? Yeah. I don't think I do. It's good to mention that sometimes you want the texture, but not the color. Okay, so let's get rid of this layer. So if I wanted, say, the texture, but I didn't want it to change the color, change the texture to a black and white. And all you have to do is click your black and white adjustment layer. Again, you want to clip it to that layer. And I'm doing that by holding the Alt or Option key on a Mac and putting your cursor between the two layers. When you get that little square with the arrow,
Mhm.
click. And now this layer is only going to affect that texture. So we've made that texture black and white, and I can hide some of these so you can see it better. Let's put a, so you can see that texture is now black and white.
Right.
So it's only going to add the texture, but not change the color of the image. So there are times when I do that as well. And then you can use the sliders to just brighten and darken the different tones in the original image. So you can really make the texture pop.
Right.
So that's a great way of changing textures, and I do that quite often. Sometimes I had one, it was in it's in a different seminar. If I have time, I'll show you. It's I had done a Nick preset and gave it a very like a sepia kind of look, and then I put a texture on it, but the texture was too dark. So I just made it a black and white, so I got the texture without changing the color. And that worked well.
Okay. Thank you.
And Diane says, do I have a way of filing the texture so you can find them easily? I'm working on it. I started filing things one way when I first started downloading textures. You know, I did it by the company I was getting them from. And then, you know, you start getting, like I said, all these ones I find online, the freebies you can download. And then I started creating it more by styles. So let me open up another folder and I can show you what I mean. Of course, now I usually use my own. So those I have in a separate file to put in the store, which makes it easier to find them. But if I go back to that assets folder and we come down here to textures and backgrounds, so you can see I have a lot by different companies that I used to download from. And then now I've started doing like bokeh, and I've got cardboard and chalkboard and Christmas lights and clouds and, you know, all different things like that. This one is a company online that has tons of great stuff. Good place for brushes too. But I kind of do them this way. So if I want something that's a gradient and I don't want to actually, this company is great. Resource Boy. I actually have something in yesterday's blog, a freebie from him, but he's got tons of great textures and gradients and things. And these are all gradients. There's 1,000 of them in the set, which is quite large, and they're free. And all his stuff is free. It's just amazing. But you can do, you know, like dark overlays. Let's see what I've got in here. So here, some great grunge ones, and these are kind of already black and white. And then there's these that are kind of like smoke, which would be, you know, great if you're creating a composite kind of a thing. Yes, you could also, Dan, tag them in Lightroom, you know, with different styles if you wanted to. I like to look at my textures here in folders rather than Lightroom. I don't know, it's just the way I've begun to do it. I do use Lightroom. I don't use it as much as I used to for whatever reason. I still use it to organize and import. But I tend to just like go to a folder and go, okay, what do I want? What am I looking for? Kind of a thing. Yeah, there's just tons. You can see I've got a lot of different things in here. You know, vintage effects. What do we got? There's a whole bunch of different ones here. Old maps. I mean, like there's just, it's endless, the stuff that is available out there. So that's kind of my filing, but I'm working
So
on
a lot of your textures, you said, do you get them free or you pay for them?
a lot of them are free. I used to, there's a few companies I bought some from early on. French Kiss Textures is great. Leslie does great work. Jay Johnson, who has the daily texture. She has beautiful painterly backgrounds and things. Two Little Owls, Denise Love, she's in Georgia. I've got thousands of her textures. I joined her texture club for a couple of years way back, and it's just every month you got a whole set of textures. So I've got lots and lots of hers. Yeah, there's some great people out there who do some really cool stuff. All right, so let's close these. So next up, this was one I had added a Lightroom preset to, but then I wanted to add a little bit more color. This is not far from where we live down here in Tennessee now. And I'm going to bring in a couple subtle kind of textures. The first one is this real pale sunrise kind of thing. We also get great clouds down here. So I've gotten so many great sky shots because you can actually see them on, open land without tons of buildings around here. And we're going to go to soft light. And I brought this one way down. And then I brought in this golden one. And this was, for the last 5 years, I've done a free set at Christmas that I give away to all my blog readers. And this was in my first set. And I use this one a lot. But I want to rotate it so this darker area is at the bottom and the brighter yellow is at the top. So you can either do the transform, or when you first bring it in, if you put your cursor outside the corner and get the curved arrow, I'm going to hold my shift key and rotate, and holding the shift keeps it moving in 15-degree increments. So you get a nice straight line when you get it flipped around and don't have to try and make it straight. And this one I'm going to do at overlay. And just wanted to give it a little more of that kind of golden hour, sunrise, warm sky look from that to that. So again, textures can be very subtle. This one's only adding a very little texture. It's more about the color with this one. All right, I got one more for you. So this was my original. And this was something I photographed in my kitchen in Connecticut. The bleeding hearts were from the front yard. And I had gotten this box of old bottles at a flea market or something, and I just left them dirty, most of them, so that they had that kind of grungy look. And this was just another piece of scrapbook paper that I draped over a book, and just window light coming in from the side. When I do things like this, I have those trifold like foam core boards that the kids use for school projects, or not even foam core, but the trifold cardboard things. And it's white, and that's what I use. And I did do some processing on this, so it's not probably pure white anymore. So this was one of the ones when I thought I was going in one direction, and then I tried a preset in Topaz and ended up going in a completely different direction with this one. The first thing I decided to do was I wanted to darken the green in this bottle. So I'm going to bring in a texture to do that. And it doesn't even have to fill the whole thing because I just needed to cover this bottle. So we're going to leave it like that. And I'm going to add a layer mask. And the easier way to do this, because I'm only need a little bit of it showing, I'm going to fill the mask with black and then paint with white where I want the color to be. So I'm going to hit my X key and Alt backspace. So basically it's all masked out right now. And I'm going to zoom in so we can see. And I'm going to grab my brush, and I want it to be a hard brush now because I've got sharper edges. And I'm going to show you a cool trick. You may or may not know it. So I want to draw a straight line from this side to that side. And maybe I could do that freehand and maybe not. But if I click once on the left, I have to be on white first. Click once on the left And then after I've done that, press my shift key and keep holding that and click on the right. It will join those 2 points. So I can do that here. And then I'm going to start doing that all the way around the bottle. I'm continuing to hold my shift key and I'm just going to keep clicking. And even though I'm going around a rounded edge, it will work for this. And we'll come all the way down here. And you can always go back and touch it up if you need to, but it just makes it much quicker than trying to freehand draw a straight line. Yep, miss a little bit there. And there. And then we can just paint the center, make the brush bigger. Now, of course, that green is much too dark. That's not what we want our bottle to look like. But of course, we have our blending modes. And we're going to change this to overlay. And then bring back the opacity. So before and after. And at the end of this project, like I said, because I changed so many times, it still accents it a little, probably not quite as much, but I always try and get, I always work with an edited image before I start playing with texture. So you always want you get your image, done first and then start doing the creative stuff afterwards. So next I brought in this other sunset kind of a texture. And this one I changed to multiply and brought it way down to about 20%. And then I brought in this grungy dark rust color. I said I thought I was going one direction. I was looking for grunge, and then I ended up completely different. But it still adds some cool texture in here. So we're going to change this one to overlay and bring back to about 70. So then, because I decided to go into Studio, this is when I create the merge layer because Studio would only see this top texture and not everything. So again, it's Control Alt Shift E or Command Option Shift E. We're going to name that merged. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer. So if I come back from Photoshop and I have something here and I go, yeah, maybe I don't like it, I can just delete that layer and I still have my merged layer to try again. So filter Studio. And I used a look or preset and I'm going to type it in since I know the name of it. And it says Lilac Wash. And completely went a totally different way, which I kind of liked. I did lower the opacity of this to like 75% because it made it a little too light, but I liked it. So we said, okay, go back to here. So now I wanted to add a bit of a vignette, and this is where changing colors and all can come into play. So the way we added the black one before, I'm going to add a new layer. But instead of filling it with black, I picked a color from this preset kind of near the edge. And I'm going to type it in. This BFABB5. So this kind of light plum sort of a color. And we're going to fill our layer. And instead of the elliptical marquee, for this one, I used the rectangular marquee. Again, I'm going to go pretty much, I just wanted like maybe a 1/4 inch or so of the vignette. And we're also going to soften it. So select Modify, Feather, and then delete. Control D deselects it. And then I lowered the opacity a little bit. So it just added a hint more color around the edges. Then I did flip my page here. I actually finished, the image was pretty much finished, but I'm like, well, it needs something to fill in this big area here. So I decided to add some type, and I'll open up my finished one and walk you through those steps. And that's what I did. So what I like to do with my writing, so I'm going to turn off the effects on these layers. So the first one, Bloom, was a typeface called Illusius, Illusias, and it is one that's available online for free. I don't know, downloaded somewhere over the years. And I chose, let's see, let's click on here. So that's the name of it here. I did this at 100 point. And I selected the color, again, I think kind of like from the branch, a darker brown, and typed my word. And then what I like to do with type, I thought this one too, the thin strokes were very thin. So I also like to add some layer styles to my type to give it some depth and dimension, and usually a drop shadow to help separate it from that background. So that's where these effects come in. And to get to the layer styles, you just double click in the blank area of your layer, and that will open up layer styles. So the first thing I did, let's turn these two off. I actually started with the stroke. So what I did was I fattened up those letters, and I used the same color as the type was and did 4 pixels on the outside of the letters. And in that way, I just made it a little bit thicker. And then I like to do bevel and emboss. And anytime you're selecting one of these, if you turn the check mark on, you also make sure that that line is highlighted so you get the proper controls in here. And the bevel and emboss gives you this like nice highlights and shadows to your letters. So it gives them that little bit of a 3D look. And then I did the drop shadow, and that's just real subtle. It just makes it stand out from that background a little bit. And then I used a different font here. So when you're changing fonts, what you want to do is before you start typing the other word, we need to create a new layer. Even though type creates its own layer, if I went in and changed the typeface to get ready to do this layer now, it would change the layer I've already done. So what you want to do is before you type your other layer, be on your type tool, hold down the shift key and click to start, and you'll see we now have a new layer. And that's how I added the other word. Then you can change your font, and we can change this. This one's called Intruding Cat, which I thought was fun. I guess, yeah, my cats intrude quite a bit. This one here, and I made this smaller. And I actually went with like 40 point, and you can choose any point size you want, including half points up to 999. And then just start typing. Oh, I'm gonna click off of there. Where you are planted. So that was how I added that one in. And then you can kind of click over on the layer and you'll see the words show up here. We can delete that one. Actually, I'm going to leave that for a second. So I wanted to get my layer effects, I'm going to duplicate from the first layer we did. If you right click and say copy layer styles, and then you can select this layer, right click and paste the layer styles. It added exactly what we did there. And then because this is smaller lettering, I went in and made some adjustments. So for like the bevel and emboss, I left that the same. 24 soften. That part I left the same. And oh no, like down here. I changed the depth to 43%. And then under the stroke size, I changed that from 4 pixels to just 1. And then the drop shadow, I just changed the spread so it wouldn't be as large, just to put it more in proportion to the lettering. And again, these are things that you'll play around with to see what you like. You can, change it, the opacity, and I like to keep it fairly subtle. And that's lettering. So if I turn that one off, and that's where we actually ended up. And that was the finished project. There's a question: with the arrival of AI, do you need all these textures on your hard drive? Your thoughts? Just curious. Yes, I still want all my textures. I am starting to play a little bit with some of the generative AI and the Adobe Firefly. But I still like to try and use my own stuff as much as possible. I do use occasionally textures from, other companies, but I usually use my own most of the time, unless there's something specific that I don't have, that I know I have from someone else. So yeah, I still like having all this stuff. And I think it will be a while before AI can do all of that kind of stuff, because it would be pretty hard to tell an AI program how to apply the textures and how you want it to look, because I don't always know how I want it to look until I start playing around with the textures. Make sense? Any questions? Cool. Well, you guys are easy. So this is me and my blog. You can also go to meredithimage.com, and there's a link to the blog. And all of this is in the stuff that I already sent to Sandy. And I will add the webinar number of the one where I did not pre-select the textures, and I will also send my brush and font resource list. We do have our next virtual conference coming up at the end of February, the 24th, 25th. It's 13 hours. We have 8 different speakers. And until the end of January, the early bird price is only $39. It's $49 after that. So it's still a really good price. And you get speaker notes, a goodie bag. We have great door prizes, and the recordings will be available for 60 days. So if you can't watch it live, or if you miss something, or you want to rewatch something, you have that opportunity. And all the info for all this stuff is on my website. We have the Barnes and Backroads workshops I do here in Tennessee. My spring workshops are full, the scheduled ones, but I can, if you have your own group of 2 or 3 people, we can do different dates. And we're doing this fall in October, we're doing a Route 66 trip and a Southwest trip. We did Route 66 last year with 2 different groups going each direction, and it was great fun. And then all my stuff is in the Peacock Studio store to check out. Thanks, Diane. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yes, do watch your record. Oh, excuse me, I have the hiccups now. Watch the recording and enjoy it, and just try it. You can't break anything. That's what I always tell you. Even with software, you can't break it. You got to just try it.
Yeah, Hazel, one question I did want to ask you. Do you ever use the smudge tool brushes to create your textures?
Occasionally, What I like to use the smudge for, it's a little trick I have. Let me see if I have something I can show you on. See what will work well on. I'll just open this branch one for now. Let's open this finished one. If I have something that I want to remove that's near the edge of a page, instead of like cloning or healing, say I wanted to get rid of this, or if I had something, a distraction in the background, is I'll use the smudge. Let's just merge this, Control-Shift-E. I'll use the smudge tool to just kind of blend it away. So it's great, like if you got like a leaf or something here and you on a dark background, I'll often use the smudge tool for that. I haven't used it probably as much on actually creating textures, but you definitely could.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, the possibilities are endless, really. It's just whatever you can think of, try it, because you never know what you might end up with.
Well, thank you very much. I put your program on texture. Was very interesting.
Thank
Learned
you.
a lot.
I'm
And
glad
I
you
think
did.
probably why you got some people are a little quiet because it's Photoshop.
That's okay. Oh, I just lost the chat box. There was another
Yeah.
question.
Yes.
Photoshop can be a little challenging for some people.
In my opinion, Topaz or Nick for the techniques that I mostly use. It kind of depends what I'm looking to do. Like I say, if I want to do something more like with the texturing kind of thing, I would use Topaz Studio because it has a lot of the looks or presets that include textures. There's actually 59 of my textures in Studio 2 that Topaz purchased from me, which I thought was really cool. I was the one who got to introduce Studio 2 when it first came out in the webinar. We had 3,000 people listening to us. They kept upping the number because it kept filling up, which was really cool. And that's how I've met a lot of my followers around the world, is through the Topaz webinars I used to do. I have lots of people in Australia, the UK, Canada, and lots of other countries as well.
Yeah, the Topaz Studio is really good. I own it
It's
myself.
great. Yeah, I
And
like I said, I don't use it as much as I used to,
Mm.
because I don't teach it as much. I used to do classes specifically on that, but because they're not selling it, I don't do that now. I do love the new Nick. I'm thrilled that they finished revamping all of the modules. I love the look that they've created with it, the whole layout. And I use Nick a lot as well. So it kind of depends what I'm looking to do as to which one I'll use. I also use Luminar a lot. Sometimes I'll do my full edit in there. And before, they had the sky replacement before Photoshop did, so I kind of got used to doing it in there, although I do it in Photoshop too. But if you're not a Photoshop user and you like to do, some creative editing, Luminar would be a good option because you can add textures and layers in there as well. Any other questions?
I think there was just one question that I answered in the chat,
Okay.
Sandy, about they wanted to know if people from the Frederick Camera Club could have access to this video recording. And I said that we post all of our videos. We get permission from the speakers on our YouTube account, and there's no code needed.
Okay. Yeah, and I told Sam we were going to keep it up for like 3 months or so.
Great.
I was going to put that in my message with the link, just to be clear when
Good.
I will be taking it down. So
Okay.
yeah, Hazel, that, I will go back to what I said in the introduction, and Kathy in our audience is the one who said it in the chat room. It mentioned the generosity, and that's what just stands out to me. Hazel, working with you on with MPA and now with Baltimore Camera Club, you are amazingly generous with your knowledge and your skills. And I can
Thank you.
see why somebody called you the distinguished texture artist. I'd never heard that before.
I haven't
love
either,
it.
so thank you.
Yeah, I found that.
Well-
So yeah, you've certainly demonstrated all of that and more
Thank
tonight.
you.
So thank you.
And I continue to do, like I said, in my blog, I give away the free textures, and I've been doing, this is my 8th year of doing that. So I've been doing this for a very long time, every week. And it's fun, but and people appreciate it. And if you weren't a follower way back when, I bundle like 6 months at a time of the old ones, and those are in my store and available at a really good price. So
Great.
so people can always get them, there's always at least 6 months worth on my available through the blog links, and then when it gets to a year, then I take the oldest 6 months and package them up. Otherwise my Dropbox gets bogged down. Even though I have a larger account, but there's still a limit to what you can keep. So anyway, and if anybody thinks of any questions, feel free to email me anytime. I love hearing from people, and I welcome your questions.
Yes.
Great.
Hearing, excellent, inspiring. It's so interesting. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Hazel.
Thank
It's been a
you.
Thanks,
delight.
everybody. Have a
Thank you,
good
Hazel.
Thank you
evening.
so
See you again
much.
soon. I'll see you
Thank you
for
for
the
attending.
MPA next month or in March.
Oh, great.
Yes, yes.
All righty.
Thanks
Take care.
everybody in person at the club there. Signing off.
Signing
Bye.
out.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guy.